Hello. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about some of the findings that I had when doing the research for my paper. First, though, I'd like to go over some of the pros and cons of this ability-based learning system, or this ability-based grouping system, or tracking, or whatever it is you want to call it. So I'll start off with the pros first. A lot of the people that argue for the tracking or ability grouping state that it's easier for teachers to teach a homogeneous classroom, a classroom full of kids that are on the same ability level. And I would probably agree with that, I think. It allows teachers to tailor the instruction to the needs of the specific groups of those students. So for those students that need some repetition, some remediation, some reinforcement, it allows those groups of kids to get that. But it also allows the students who want a little more in-depth study or would like to get some advanced instruction to also have the opportunity to do that in those classes. I know, for example, in our school, I teach 8th grade Spanish, Spanish 1, 2, 3, and a Spanish 4 I'll be offering next year. And I know when I teach my Spanish 8th grade level or Spanish 1 and 2, it's a little more difficult to do than when I'm teaching my Spanish 3 and 4, because when you get to Spanish 3 and 4, you have those kids that are a little more advanced, I would say. And in North Bend, when you get to Spanish 3 and 4, I'm getting the kids that would like to be in there, and they're not taking it because of a credit that they need, but it's they want to be there. So I would definitely say that the ability to teach those kids in the Spanish 3 and 4 level is much easier than it is to teach the kids in Spanish 1, 2, or 8th grade level, because I'm having to go from some of the higher ability learners to the kids who are struggling with the information a little bit, and you have to try and find a middle ground somewhere. And unfortunately, kids get lost both ways. Because of that, some of those combined classes, you bore some of those kids who are ready to move on, and you really confuse some of the kids who aren't able to keep up with the information. The other argument a lot of people give for tracking is they ask, should gifted kids have to suffer? Should they have to sit through a class where they're bored, or should their education have to take a back seat to the education of some kids who are not as developed in the class? The other study I found, it was from the Brookings Institute, the Brown Center Report on American Education. They showed data that said high ability learning kids perform better in those classes. So those are some of the advantages of doing the tracking. Those high ability kids who would typically maybe not do as well in a normal class because either A, they get bored, or B, they're no longer interested in what's going on. They do better because they're challenged in those courses. Talking about some of the arguments against it, tracking kind of started off back in a time, where there was segregation. And now, whether you want to believe it or not, it's kind of become an internal segregation that, the minorities typically end up in that class. A lot of the kids that are minorities or from low socioeconomic backgrounds, they end up in those classes. Another con, the tracking labels kids early on in school, whether it's in elementary school that they do them, whether it's in middle school or high school. Kids are labeled early on, and those labels kind of stay with them through school. Going along with that, teachers and students' expectations match the label that they're given. A kid who is given a high ability learner expectation, those kids are now under pressure to achieve at that level all the time, or they think that someone will consider them dumb now. And on the flip side, teachers expect great work out of those kids, and when it doesn't happen, sometimes teachers don't know how to adjust to that. The other end of the spectrum, you've got kids who aren't listed as high ability learners, so they're like, okay, well, if I'm not a high ability learner, that must make me a low ability learner. And those kids are now, they have that stigma walking around with them, whether they think it or their peers think it, I know when I was in school, they had different levels of math, and you would always hear the kids, whether they were joking or not. Some kids would say, "Well, I'm in dumb math." You're in smart math. So those labels do stick around, whether or not they're a joke amongst the kids is a different story. Um, and along with the teachers' expectations for those kids, for the kids that are on the lower end of that spectrum, teachers, they provide more of a high degree of written and structured work, and a lot of times the argument is said that there's minimal proficiency is needed from them, whereas if you go to the high ability learning classes, there's a lot of more critical thinking, critical work, a little more freedom on what they're able to do as far as their learning projects. We talked about, it condemns kids to a lesser education, and a disproportionate number of minorities end up in those classes, and it contributes to the widening achievement gap, or the con, is another con. So those are kind of the arguments for and against it. I would kind of like to talk about my personal experiences with tracking or grouping, whatever you want to call it. So I'll start off with the earlier one, and I talk about these in my paper as well. But in the first grade, I was, I guess, what you would consider a low ability reader at first. Most other kids in first grade were reading full sentences and full small books for a first grade level. I'm having trouble reading the sentence "see spot run." So my teachers identified that, and I was pulled from class during the reading portions or during the reading centers, and taken into another classroom with another group of kids who, like me, were having trouble reading. And I believe, I want to say that program was called LEAP, or I don't know what that program, I guess it doesn't matter what it was called, but either way, in that classroom, basically we were given extra attention, and we were able to do exercises and extra reading to eventually get us up to the proficient level. Now, fast forward 3 years, some people would argue that that separation would would have labeled me or kept me at that lower reading level my entire life, and I thought that I would think that I'm a dumb reader, as some would say, or a slow reader. But if you fast forward 3 years to the fourth grade level, we're taking the good old Terra Nova test, and I score in the reading comprehension in the 99th percentile of all kids that took it. So I went from being a low level reader in the first grade to, in the fourth grade, being one of the better reading comprehension kids that took that test. Now, obviously, standardized tests aren't always the best way to show, whether someone understands the information or not. But I feel like it was a good measure on my level of improvement, and I think the success that program had for me. So in that case, I do have a successful program, or a successful way to show how tracking did help me in that case. The other case, I think a lot of people have the same experience, and I think they still do now. In the fifth grade, we had to take a placement test for math, moving into middle school for sixth grade. And there was like level 1, 2, or 3, or level A, B, or C. And the highest level you could score would be putting you in classes with eighth graders, and it'd be the super advanced math. The second level you could score would be more advanced math. You'd be in classes with like seventh graders for that. And then there would be the basic level math that everyone would take, or the next level that you would move on to regardless. And that would be, you'd be in classes with all your peers. I scored in that second level math and was in classes with seventh graders for the remainder of my math. And then by the end of high school, I was able to take calculus for college credit. And I know there was a couple other, the more advanced level was able to have kids take some other forms of trigonometry and statistics and other higher level math classes that they also got college credit for. But I was able to get credit for calculus. And then the other kids who were in the normal regular math, as they called it, they got the graduation requirements. They went through Algebra 1, Algebra 2, or Advanced Algebra, whatever you'd call it. And they got the graduation requirements to get into a university if they needed it. So those are kind of my personal experiences. And I would say that they weren't really negative by any means. Obviously the first one's really positive, and then the second one's probably the average experience of a high schooler today, because I know we have different math classes now. But to kind of talk about my personal opinion on the whole thing, I am kind of in the middle of the road as far as whether we should use tracking or not. I definitely lean a little more towards using tracking or, achievement grouping or ability grouping, simply because I've had some positive experiences with it, obviously. And it's not like it's anything new. These sorts of things have been around for a long time. We've been doing math this way for forever. As long as I can remember, we've been doing math this way, and we still do it in North Bend Central. We have the Algebra A, Algebra B type classes and things like that. So I definitely do feel like there's a place for it in schools. However, we do need to be careful on, how we're doing it. We need to make sure that it doesn't end up separating those kids, like some of the people that would argue against tracking would say that it separates kids by race, it separates kids by socioeconomic class, it separates kids by gender. As educators, we definitely need to see and make sure that we have the best interests of each individual child in mind when we do recommendations for these types of classes. But like I said, my personal opinion, I think there is a place for it in school, but we need to be careful with kind of how we're going about that. So thank you for allowing me to share my opinions and my findings today, and have a good afternoon.